John Lothian News wants you to be safe and for us to be able to return to being with one another again. To get there, we need to do the following to beat this pandemic. Wear a mask, stay 6 feet apart, wash your hands for 20 seconds at a time, and self-monitor your temperature. Stay safe, stay smart.
Help capture the history of our markets by contributing to the John Lothian News GoFundMe campaign to support the Markets Wiki Education history-focused video series and more.
Board of Trade traded 80% of its volume was ag, soybeans and corn, the majors, and 20% financials, which was primarily bonds and GNMAs. And, it was, the financial futures were considered successful by that time because the Board of Trade was the biggest exchange in the world, so it had a lot of volume, and 20% of that was pretty good. But it was pretty obvious that that was the growth area for the exchange because there was really no new commodities for the Board of Trade to trade. So it was going to have to grow with financials. When I came in 1980, the Board of Trade had only done one media trip to New York in its history. That's because they depended on the Chicago bureaus of the New York media to cover the exchanges, and that worked pretty well. But the primary financial reporters for the New York media were in New York and not Chicago. So the bureaus here in Chicago for the New York media and for the international media were primarily focused on agriculture. For the first 1980, 1981, and into 82, we did a large number of educational tours primarily in New York, and then went to New York to introduce the president, the chairman, to the media in New York, and really focused on the media in New York for the first time. We went to Europe for the first time the Board of Trade had ever done. I think the Merc had gone to Europe once, and so we went over as a staff. There were 2 of us from staff that went over and did a 3-week tour to kind of understand what was on the ground and who was doing what. And Life was had a board that was developing the exchange. Frankfurt was interested, Paris was interested, and of course there were commodity exchanges in Europe, similar but not the same as futures, but they called themselves commodity exchanges, and we visited them, but they were not interested in developing financials. There was the banks and the trading firms that were interested in developing the financial futures. And so we presented Life with an agreement by 82 to help them develop the exchange, and that's when the Board of Trade seriously went to Europe and developed a lot of relationships. And from 1981 till 85, I'd say 40% of our time was focused on the European media and the European market. And the reason why the European media took off so much was because their financial reporters didn't come from the agricultural community. They were financial reporters, and they were very interested in the U.S. financial markets because they knew that the European markets were just starting or going to be starting soon. So it was a great time to just educate. And we did everything from all the different financial futures, but then when futures options started as well, I mean, that was a whole new thing. And so we did a lot of educational tours with that as well. And eventually, pretty early, started a London office as well. What really took off were the options. And when we started options on bonds and started options on notes, those were the big financial futures. I mean, there were some on the metal side and things like that were very large, but those the primary ones. I would say that the most interest came from Europe, and the Far East on the options on the financial futures. They started to feel it in the late 80s because the Merck's financial contracts really took off. By 1990, the Merck was actually doing more financial futures contracts than the Board of Trade was. Now, that didn't mean the Merck was any larger because the Board of Trade, when you add the commodities to the financial futures, it was still a much larger exchange. But just in financials, by that time the Merck had the S&P, and that's what really took off and brought in a huge amount of volume. And then the options as well. So when you saw that segment that was really the growth segment of the industry suddenly go to another exchange as far as increases in volume, it was scary. I think the Board of Trade tried really hard to figure out what new contracts could come up. But if you look at the number of new contracts that were added between, let's say, 88 to 92, 93, not many. It was really the significant increases were on those primary contracts that were already established. So the Board of Trade had to put a lot of money into those financial futures that they had, but there was a limit. And if you didn't have new contracts, new products, then it was going to be a tough issue. Being the largest exchange in the world, and obviously in the U.S., the biggest issue politically for the Board of Trade was always taxes and user fees. And those were always issues either with CFTC or with Congress. And so the Board of Trade and the Merck, but the Board of Trade had a huge, huge interest in the political arena in Washington and in Illinois, because there was always the threat of user fees and increased taxes based on individual contracts. And so it was very important to make sure the story was told in Washington and in Springfield about how not to tax an industry that was bringing in so much to the world, into the United States, into Illinois. Tom Donovan was a political master. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure there was anyone else who had the kind of political savvy that he did. He certainly had the connections because of his time with Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley in Chicago, and he understood politics like no one. And because of that, the Board of Trade put a lot of money and a lot of time behind it. And I think it was really valuable because the bigger the Board of Trade got, the more visible they became, and thus the bigger target they became from a tax and user fee standpoint. The Board of Trade believed that because of the way in which Dow Jones Company did not require any kind of fee to be used when people listed the index, the Board of Trade believed that it was a public entity, that it was not, even though it was a copywritten, and Dow Jones owned the copyright to the index, Dow Jones never required any of the other news outlets when they quoted the Dow to a fee behind it. So as a result, the Board of Trade believed that it was a public entity, thus that they did not need the approval from Dow to list the index. The Board of Trade lost that, but the Board of Trade did have a contract that mimicked the Dow. All but one stock was in the index that the Board of Trade had, and Major Market Index was the name of it. It didn't really do very well by that time. The S&P was trading well, and the OEX was trading. I think everybody thought that the Dow was a better index because it was so widely known, but I think it proved that the S&P was a more interesting index to base a futures contract on than the Dow because the Dow was so small and limited. And the S&P had much more volatility to it because of the number of stocks that were in it, and a much bigger index. I would say it was the worst day of my life. It was, the Board of Trade had never had a board meeting in New York. The board meetings were always in Chicago, even though maybe a third of the board were people from New York. And the Board of Trade decided that it was time to have a New York board meeting. So we had it, we decided sometime in the summer of '87 to do it. So we had it all organized and established. And of course, the market tanked on Friday. And then on Monday was the day that all of the board members from Chicago went to New York for the board meeting. So we were all on a plane early Monday morning, got to New York, and of course by that time the market was just not gone down all the way, but was tanking very fast. And going in the car from LaGuardia to Wall Street was one of the worst cab drives I've ever had in my entire life. Because I was sitting next to the chairman, and the chairman was using a mobile phone, which I had never seen in my life before, and it was nothing but bad news. We went to Goldman Sachs because one of the board members was from Goldman Sachs, and we were in the trading room when it just really, really tanked. And I thought the world was going to end. We left Goldman Sachs, and I thought I was going to see people jumping out of the buildings. But you know what? Nobody seemed to know, and nobody seemed to care. People were walking down around Wall Street like nothing happened. And I thought, well, this just kind of shows you that what a reality check of what most people really were thinking about rather than the market. But it was so bad by that time that the Board of Trade directors decided not to have the board meeting the next day on Tuesday, and Monday night they all left. We had a press conference scheduled for Tuesday morning, and there wasn't enough time by the time we had decided not to hold the board meeting to cancel the press conference. So we had a press conference on Tuesday morning, and by that time the New York Stock Exchange had blamed the futures markets. And the Board of Trade was the number one target because we were still the largest. Even though we didn't trade the largest index, Merck did, the Board of Trade the New York Stock Exchange had named the Board of Trade as the culprit. And we went ahead and had the press conference, and the Vice President of Economic Analysis and I led the press conference and did the press conference, and it was truly the worst press conference I ever experienced in my entire life. Everybody was just screaming and saying, why in the world did the futures markets exist if they were the culprits to have something like this happen to the markets? And it was just ridiculous because we knew that the futures market was actually the market that saved the market. And the reason why it came back up so quickly was because of the futures market. Now, again, because of the lack of understanding of the general press, the financial press pretty much understood that, but the general press were the ones that were most interested because they were the ones that the New York Stock Exchange were talking to. And they wanted to get that monkey off their back. And they successfully did that by blaming the futures market for the crash. I'd have to say that the FBI investigation is really what kind of did me in. You know, I was at the Board of Trade from 1980 to 1990. And by the 9th year of being in charge of PR for the Board of Trade, you know, it was a tremendous job. It was the best job I think I ever had. It was really great because of the timing of it. But the FBI investigation was awful. It was really terrible. I can't remember a time when there weren't rumors that there was an investigation going on the trading floors. I mean, there were constant rumors that there were FBI people or people that were investigating the market, the traders and the pits and everything. So we kind of took it with a grain of salt because there were always rumors about that. So I think that everyone was incredibly surprised when it actually was announced because there had been so many rumors that something like that was going on for years and years and years. The way in which it occurred and the lack of transparency that occurred in the information that was given to the exchange was really appalling. And the exchange really had absolutely no information. And because of that, there was no way in which we could really respond. And we were bombarded. And I remember at the time, the commodities editor of the Wall Street Journal was based here in Chicago. And Sue Schallenbarger, she was one of the best reporters I've ever worked with in my entire life. She said that it was the worst story that she ever had to deal with as an editor and from a reporter because of the lack of information that was given to reporters as well as she knew to the exchanges. And so that was an incredibly difficult story to follow and to try to figure out exactly the truth. After 6 months of that bombardment, without being able to really reply or being able to really fully develop the story and work with reporters, because that story opened up a whole gamut of reporters that never even knew what futures were. And the primary stories were actually coming out of publications that never, ever had covered the futures market before. Washington Post is a really great example. The Washington Post had never probably ever printed a story about the futures market in their entire life. And yet they had stories in the Washington Post all over the place about this because it was an FBI investigation. And so when you're dealing with reporters and editors that don't have a clue about what the markets were and how to explain that at a time when no one really fully understood from the exchange standpoint what was going on and what had gone on, and even what the results were going to be, even the immediate results were going to be, it was nearly an impossible story to get your hands around to feel like we could really have a decent chance to explain who we were, because most of the reporting came from non-financial reporters. The exchanges were always good at putting together blue ribbon committees, and it got kind of to a point where people thought, well, wow, here's another blue ribbon committee about an issue. But the value of it was that we knew we were speaking to people who didn't understand the industry. There had to be people who could tell the story in a way to an audience that never even understood or heard of the futures market. So some of those people on those panels, both the Mercs and Board of Trade, were people who could really stand up and tell the story of the value of the markets. And that was really more important to the exchange than anything else, because there wasn't really much the exchange could do until, or if there was going to be any indictments or waited for anything to come down from that standpoint. We had to go on the offensive to try to explain what in the world these markets were to a market that never ever heard of them before.
John Lothian News would like to thank those individuals who have contributed to our Markets Wiki Education GoFundMe campaign. Their financial assistance allows us to produce and distribute videos like this for our Open Outcry Traders History Project or the Path to Electronic Trading video series. Join them in supporting John Lothian News, capturing the history of our industry.